Hello and welcome to today's watercolour workshop. In today's video we're going to be going back to basics and looking at what watercolour paint is and learning about the different materials used to create a watercolour painting, understanding the paper, the paints and the brushes and how to use them in basic step-by-step instructions. Let's get started, shall we? Watercolour paper is designed to hold lots of water. Watercolour paper comes in two main different varieties, hot press, which is a smoother finish, and cold press, which comes in different textures, including smooth and rough. Watercolour paper is unlike any other paper because it is designed to hold the water. So unlike copy paper and cartridge paper, which will buckle and bend and tear, watercolour paper will remain smooth when adding water to the surface. Not all watercolour paper is created equal, though. The more expensive watercolour papers are made from 100% cotton and are the best to use. Cheaper watercolour paper, though, will often peel and buckle when water is applied to the surface. For this reason, it is always better to use a more expensive quality watercolour paper to get the best results. There is no point starting a really good painting on a cheap piece of paper and finding that your work is ruined because it starts peeling halfway through the painting. Whether you use hot press or cold press is up to you. There is no right or wrong answer. It just depends on what you're painting. I like using hot press for the smooth surface, whereas a lot of landscape artists enjoy using the cold press paper with the texture because it helps with their paintings. What is watercolour paint? Watercolour paint is a translucent paint, and unlike oils or acrylics that have a binder in them to make them opaque, watercolour is basically pure pigment. Because of this, we need to work with watercolour paints slightly differently to other paints. In watercolours, we work light to dark, keeping the paper clear for our white highlights, as there is no white paint in watercolour paints. Here you can see me demonstrating with colour how translucent watercolour paints actually are. Watercolour comes in two varieties. You get the tubes of paint and then the most commonly used, the half pans, which you can see me using on the screen now. The tubes are highly concentrated and only a small amount of paint needs to be squeezed out. The pans are great for travel and painting on the go because you have them and you have all your colours easily accessible and require only water to activate them. The great thing about watercolours is that you can use the tubes to refill your pans, and once they dry they can easily be reactivated again and again with water. When working with watercolours, always bring your paint to your palette and mix on your palette even if you're using a pure colour from the pan. This is because you want to create a translucent layer. The best way to work in watercolours is to work in very thin, fine layers. Because watercolour can't be painted over like oils and acrylics, it's best to work really light and build up to your darkest colours. That way then, if you make a mistake, it is easier to try and cover it up. Some brands of paint that are fantastic quality are Winsor & Newton or Art Spectrum. Buying really good quality paint may seem expensive at first, but the payoff is well worth it. Painting is hard enough, and you do not want to make it harder on yourself by using poorer quality materials. Cheaper paints often have less pigment, and therefore you go through more to build up to the same opacity as you would with the more expensive paints. More expensive paints have fantastic colour payoff. You can see here how bright the paints still are even though I've thinned them out with a lot of water. The key to watercolour painting is water. Don't be afraid to add lots of water to your colours and work very thinly. You will find that your results are better doing it this way. When working in thin layers as well, it dries very quickly, so it's easy to knock out a watercolour painting quite quickly, which is why watercolour paints are often favoured to do plein air painting or painting out in nature, because you can get a quick sketch down and take it back to your studio to finish. Watercolour brushes are designed to hold a lot of water. Their bristles are a lot softer than that of oil or acrylic brushes. To start off with, you will find that you will only need a couple of brushes as they are very versatile. I like using the round nib brushes because I find that I can get the most variety out of having just a few brushes. Using a good quality round nib brush, you will find that having one large, roughly around a size 10 to 12, and one size 4 or 2 will be enough to get you started. Brushes are expensive, but looking after them properly means that you will have them for a very long time. A few tips is to never leave them sitting in the water once you've finished. This is a big no-no. Because what will happen is it will bend the bristles and the water will soak up into the ferrule of the brush, causing the handle to swell and separate from the bristles. Always dry your brush by lying it down and not upright, because any water that is trapped in the brush will leak back into the handle and also cause it to swell. You can see here that I can get quite a variety of brush strokes using just a single brush. Here, using the flat side of the brush, I am able to get some big broad strokes in. Using pressure and using the flat side of the brush and pushing it along the surface will get you big fat lines. Then using just the tip of the brush and a lighter pressure, you can get finer lines. It all comes down to practice and brush control. Brushes can be made of synthetic or natural fibres. It's a matter of personal preference which style you will use. You will find though that synthetic fibres are a lot cheaper than the natural fibres. You can reshape the tips of your brush by dipping them in hot water if you find that the bristles have bent out of shape. Also, at the end of the day, when you are finished using your brush and have washed it out correctly, just gently reshape the bristles with your fingers, and when you lay them down flat, make sure you put them in a brush roll or in a case that won't bend them. Watercolour brushes have shorter handles than acrylic or oil brushes and are designed to be held like a pencil. Again, here you can see how delicately and fine the lines I can get compared to how fat I was using the brush before. It's all just a matter of pressure. Watercolour pencils are essentially the watercolour paint pressed into pencil form. They can be used in many different ways and are fantastic to use for drawing fine detail or for having a variety of colours that you may not have in your palette. In our other videos, I go into more depth about the pencils and show you a whole variety of techniques that you can use with them. Here I'm showing you how you can colour a swatch on a separate piece of paper and pick the colour up similar to how you would from a pan. And then while the surface is still wet, you can draw into your paint with a pencil to get an inky-like quality. Like most art materials, the better the quality of the pencils you use, the better results you will get. Here I am using Faber-Castell Albert Dürer pencils, which you can easily buy individually from most good art supply stores. You don't need a set as big as what I have here, and in fact I recommend just purchasing colours that you find you will use a lot. Watercolour pencils are great to have in your watercolour kit because you can draw up any images that you are going to be painting and have the lines completely dissolve into the painting, so you don't get any unsightly graphite lines throughout your watercolour painting. Also dip your pencil into the water and draw with it like that. You will find that you will get the same inky texture as you do drawing on a wet surface. Just keep in mind that if you do this, you can ruin the lead in the pencil by soaking it too much. Now I am going to demonstrate the wet on wet technique. This is the main technique used in watercolour painting. Here I am just wetting the surface of my paper with just clear water. Give a few seconds for the water to settle into the page. You will find it will create a gloss-like finish on the page. Now dipping into my colour. Here I am using cadmium yellow. I'm just going to drop the colour sporadically across the page, and you will see how the plain water helps spread the colour out across the page. This is wet on wet. You can get fantastic results using wet on wet. I am just painting a small abstract painting here, just experimenting with colour and dropping it across the surface. We will use this painting at the end of the video where I can show you what you can do with this. Using good quality paints help you with the wet on wet technique because they are more likely to spread. You will find though that some pigments aren't as prone to spreading as others, and this is just the nature of that pigment. In this particular painting, the amount of water on the surface of the page doesn't matter so much because I am going for an abstract look. However, if you are trying to make it slightly more controlled, have a piece of blotting paper, such as paper towel or toilet paper, near you so you can pick up any excess water off the surface. Also, wringing out your brush and blotting it on a piece of paper and then using a drier brush, you will be able to pick up water off the surface of the page. You will find that some colours will stain more than others, especially yellows, they tend to stain. This will make it harder for you to lift colour, which is why I always recommend going in lightly and using light layers. Wet on wet doesn't have to be done on a clear background, it can be done on a coloured background. And you can also drop plain water into a coloured background to get some excellent pitting effects. Wet on dry is a good technique to use if you want a more controlled painting. Here I'm just demonstrating a flat wash where I have put colour on my brush and then just using the flat side of it, I am spreading it across a dry page. Wet on dry is also fantastic for creating finer details because your paint will not spread with the water. like using wet on dry to create water because I then get that nice overlapping feel of shadows to make it look like ripples on the water surface. Now let's put all our techniques together. Using the wet on wet surface that I created earlier, I'm going to use a watercolour pencil to sketch in a botanical shape. Even though the colour will dissolve into the painting, I still want to go very lightly with this because I don't want that grey tone to take over. Once you have finished sketching up the picture, you are now going to paint around the picture or the negative space using gouache. The Liquitex gouache that I am using has a great flow, so you do not need to add any water to it. Painting the negative space can be difficult because you have to retrain your brain to think about what you're actually painting. Just take it slow and steady and think about it. Art doesn't need to be a race. You can see that I'm varying the pressure of my brush. So to get into the really fine details, I'm using the very tip of the brush and applying minimal pressure. For the wider strokes outside away from the detail, I'm using the flat of the brush and applying more pressure. You can see now that the leaves are emerging and the positive space, which is the leaves, are now the beautiful pattern that we painted in the beginning. And the background is going to be plain white. Flipping your picture and looking at it from different angles will help you with perspective. It will also help you reach more difficult parts. It is important to look at your painting from all different angles to make sure that you have perspective throughout the piece. There's nothing worse than sitting at a piece for hours and then picking it up and looking at it from a distance and finding that you have the perspective wrong. using a broader brush, I'm just quickly filling in the background. Going back in with my fine brush, I'm just going to tidy up some of the edges and make sure that everything is as opaque as I want it to be. These little botanical paintings can be a starter where you can go on and add more layers. You can watch our watercolor collage video to see that technique. Or you can leave it as is and use it as a card or just little paintings to put up around your home. Once you're happy with how it all looks, remove the tape, and once it's fully dry, erase any leftover guidelines. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. We definitely enjoyed having you here. Remember to check out our Facebook page and our website where you can keep up to date with what's happening at Artworks, and see our other videos where you can use the techniques learned in today's video and apply them to a whole heap of different projects. If you do any of the projects, remember to share them with us because we'd love to see what you're creating. Thank you and stay creative.